Welcome to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice, as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We will relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we chose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.
Well, we're back to Moments That Matter. What an awesome opportunity to be back together. Last time when we were talking to each other, we left off a big chunk of your life that centered around Ukraine. And I think it'd be great if we had a chance to talk about that today. After you got your doctorate and you were professor there at UNC Wilmington, how long were you there total?
I was there 9 years.
9 years.
Mm-hmm.
Then what happened between end of year 9 and showing up in Ukraine?
A lot. But it started quite a bit before that. It started actually the year before. And I think that this is actually important to talk about because maybe others have had this kind of experience or are experiencing it and don't know why they're experiencing it. And it is this idea of, I've tried to put it like having the anchors kind of pulled up in your life, but just drifting and not really getting anywhere or doing anything, knowing that you're kind of ready to do something, but you don't know what. And so that's the way it was for me the year before I left UNC Wilmington. And during that time, professionally, the work for me, especially grant work, had kind of run out. And so I was casting around, looking for what's the next thing. Spiritually, though, God was really convicting me of a lot of stuff and just constantly. And I call it cleaning me out. And so that happened all summer long. This would be between the 8th and 9th year. And then at the beginning of the 9th year, we had a pastor join us at our church just for a year as an interim. And this is a wildly charismatic guy. And what I mean by that is like charismatic gifts kind of guy. And he had been attending a conference up in Toronto every year at Catch the Fire. And he said, well, why don't you come with me? And he started recruiting in our church. Why don't you come with me? And so we had this kind of, I actually had a small group that I was part of, and most of the small group decided to go. So we decided to go, fine. Also happening at the exact same time, I was a deacon for a number of years, and I was elected as an elder. So this happened literally just in this time frame, like in September. And so then we head off to this conference, and I could write a book, and I actually am writing a book, and I could have a whole other podcast about this particular experience. Just suffice it to say, there were things that were introduced to us, especially again in terms of like charismatic gifts and stuff like that, that we really had not encountered before, my wife and I. And it turned out to be super important because when we got back, there was a healing service at our church that was meeting every Tuesday, and I started to go just to pray for people and stuff like that. And sometime in, say, a month or so, the person who was leading that had a heart attack. This was a pastor in our church. And so because I had been attending and because I was now an elder in the church, I was invited to take over leadership of this healing service. And sure enough, people were getting healed, and I was preaching, and I think pretty powerfully. And so there was a woman who had been attending this service, and she noticed this like change in me, and she had been doing some short-term missions work in Ukraine and also in Bulgaria. And so she just kind of watched me for a few months, and she had discovered that there was a need for a mentoring couple in Ukraine, starting in the next year. And so on one of her trips, she literally sent me an email about this and then closed the laptop and left for 2 weeks. And she was completely out of communication. And so what she said in this email was that, well, we need this mentoring couple. We have a young staff in this institute that oversees a bunch of Bible schools in 3 different countries, and it's a lot, and they need some wisdom, basically. And so I'm reading through this almost like you would read some kind of advertisement for a position in a newspaper or something like that. And then down at the bottom, she says, and we can arrange a visit for you if you'd be interested in finding out more. And I was just like, oh, she's talking about me, And so there was just something in me that just kind of leaped up, and it was just like, yep, this is the thing. This is what we've been waiting for this whole time, with the anchors pulled up and drifting around and stuff like that. And this was kind of the wind that was waited for the sails, to start moving. Well, my wife took a little bit longer to convince of this, but nonetheless, it did happen. And so we agreed to come for a year. And so I took a leave of absence from my university for a year. And this is the way it is on the mission field. If you talk to any missionary who's been there any length of time, they'll tell you, I came for a year and I stayed for 7, whatever. Yeah. And, or much longer. And in our case, that's exactly what happened. So we came for a year, and then in the middle of the year, decided that, hey, actually we've got stuff to do. And so then we kind of shed the job and the house and everything else like that, and then stayed for a little longer.
So this is interesting. It makes me think you were in a great situation. You're in your mid-40s, tenured associate professor. Your wife had a successful business. Your teenage son was starting middle school. You had a great servant position in the church you were in. But there was something that you sensed within that maybe there was just something missing. Would you say that there was when you found the Ukrainian option available, when it was put in front of you, did you see it as, I'm really sacrificing all these things that I have in the States to go over there? Or did you see it as such a great opportunity that it just overshadowed anything that you currently had going on?
Yeah, on the face of it, there was no reason to go. I was in my mid-40s. Our son was in middle school. He was 13 when we went over, and had all of his friends. And we had been there, as I said, for 9 years, and loved the place. We're in our dream house. Loved my job. Loved the church. I mean, literally, there was no reason to go. And that tells me that it's God that just kind of puts that desire in your heart. Because then trying to convince other people that it was a good idea, including relatives and friends, turned out to be a big chore. And interestingly, the biggest chore was trying to convince other Christians, other people of faith.
Sure.
People who were not Christians, people who didn't care a whit about the church or God, said, this is awesome. This will be a great adventure for you guys. You should definitely take advantage of it. That was not the case
Mhm,
with
sure.
most of our friends and family. My mother-in-law said quite blatantly that we were depriving our son of a normal upbringing. My mother, who had taught me to respect and honor missionaries and support them and pray for them, my whole upbringing, was wondering if I was really that kind of person, that would become a missionary. And I'm like, Mom, where do you think missionaries come from? They grow up from little boys,
Yeah.
and little girls. So yeah, it was kind of a tough road to hoe, not just going but staying, because people were like, okay, you're ready to come back now. I mean, especially like our mother-in-law, taking her first grandson, over to this dangerous country, which it wasn't.
Sure.
And like, well, so you're staying for a year, right? Well, actually, it turns out we're going to stay a little bit longer. You are what?
Mhm.
So yeah, it was this ongoing battle, the whole 7 years,
I think for people who may be listening and find themselves in a position where they think, am I hearing from God? They are considering something that they feel their heart being warmed to. Maybe their passions for what they're doing are starting to wane, and they wonder why, when they've got such a great setup like you described, they would find something more. In the midst of that, where's the Clearness Committee? There's people who are no doubt putting you on a guilt trip, discouraging you to go, but there's also a group of people who, with great wisdom, are luring you into the next stage. Where's the Clearness Committee in that situation?
There were at least two in that particular story. One was the pastor that I mentioned. And just like I said, the almost unexplainable reaction that I had to this idea of going to the conference, which I knew nothing about. But nonetheless, it was like, you've been waiting for this. You need to go and do this. And so, in a sense, it is the Clearness Committee, because you have this older, wiser person who's saying, hey, have you thought about this? So that may be actually one of the closest times to a Clearness Committee experience that I've had. The other one is that email that was sent from this woman from our church, because this was a path that I had never considered. I mean, my wife and I had talked about being missionaries after I retired or something like that, and go work at a school overseas or, something. But in the middle of your life, just to pick up and go, never, ever. So it's just this, one of the things that I would kind of characterize these Clearness Committee moments as is, there is this information or this revelation, whatever you want to call it, that is sort of beyond you. That is something that you just simply haven't considered. And it may come from a person, but it may come from circumstances. It could come from a lot of different ways. And you just understand that, there are these voices speaking to you that are quite a bit larger than you are. And that this is this time, and I'd like to say that I've always taken advantage of these times, but I haven't, and it sounds very noble to pick up in the middle of your life and go overseas and be a missionary. But the truth is that I have had, different times in my life where I could have chosen to do something different, but I haven't. I've done kind of the expected thing, the usual thing, and it's a kind of regret, but you just kind of say, well, sorry, God, and you move on,
I think there's a lot to be said for those trusted people in a sort of Clearness Committee moment, and also the inward witness of the Holy Spirit. I know also a big Quaker tenet is the light within everyone, that we all have a measure of God's Spirit within as we focus on Him and as we're led by Him, and recognizing the alignment internally with those voices and circumstances and email and things you see outwardly. That's incredible. Well, so you went, and as you aptly described, 1 year's not enough. What was it there that took place? an event or a series of events that caused you to say, look, 1 year, we're not finished in 1 year. We're going to stay the long haul?
Well, as I said, the staff for the institute that I wound up directing was very young. Most of them were in their 20s, and it was a big job. I mean, it was thousands of students in multiple locations in 3 different countries, and it's a lot. And so it just turned out that once we got there, we kind of discovered some things about, especially the director. There's a lot of emotional abuse going on in the office. There were unethical things that were being asked of the staff to benefit this director. And so I finally told my supervisor, who was in Poland, I said, you need to come and visit and see this, and interestingly, this director had been installed, director who was a Ukrainian, had been installed by the supervisor. So this was his guy, and he came, and sure enough, it was exactly, what I had said. And so he pulled him out of the director position and asked me, because I happened to be handy, would I take over for 6 to 8 months? And for anyone who has never been in this situation before, because I'm an interim right now, and that's a very tenuous situation. And anybody who tries to promise you some timeline, just don't even bother. just ignore it completely, because it's not true.
Sure.
And so I, took over. It took a solid month, because this guy was very resistant, to tell me all the information I needed, bank accounts, everything, And so finally that happened. And once it happened, I understood, people needed healing, in the staff. Churches needed unity, who were hosting these different, Bible schools and stuff like that. There was just a big need. And so it just became obvious that we should stay. And so, as I said, I resigned my position, which my department head was not happy about, because she had made me promise that I would only be there a year. And so then I had to resign anyway, and sold the dream house. And, we had to move our son, to a new school, all these kinds of things. But anyway, so that's really what kind of told us that. But, honestly, the whole time we were there, except for 1 year, we were always year to year. We were always like, should we stay another year? Yeah, we should stay another year. Until our son was a junior in high school. And we thought, well, we're not going to pull him out in senior year, so we'll stay 2 years. That was as far as we planned ahead, And so you've got some of these missionaries who were just career, and, they knew they wanted to be missionaries from when they were little children, and they have gone through language school and all this preparation. We had nothing. I mean, we met with a Ukrainian in the States who was teaching kindergarten, and she taught us the Cyrillic alphabet. That's how much time we had before we left. Mm-hmm. That's all. Everything else was on the fly. And, so just for anyone out there thinking about being a missionary or working overseas in any capacity, there are these career people, but don't let that intimidate you, because mostly they're not career people. Mostly it was a surprise to them, that they wound up with that kind of calling. And you don't have to go seeking it. It's something that'll find you. If you're just kind of yielded to the whole thing, it'll find you, because there's such a need overseas in so many ways, in so many countries.
Wow, you make an excellent point. And I think that probably demonstrates the shift that there's been sort of in global missions. I know from my work in seminary, we read about the missionaries who packed their belongings in coffins, and they went, and it was sometimes a weeks-long journey to get where they're going. They want to correspond with people back home. It was letter writing that would take weeks to go and weeks to return, and it was a truly sold-out, all-in moment. But do you think the nature of the world as it is today maybe lends itself more towards mission seasons where people go because travel is so easy now? Communicating cross-culturally is a lot easier now because there's so much more widespread information of cultures that you can read before you get there. Do you think that's shifted the face of world missions?
I think it's all of that, and it's also that it's more acceptable now to be in different careers and different vocations, during the course of your life. There was a time, like with my father's generation, you were expected to be with one company your whole career. And same thing for missions, so I think that's changing. And, there's a need, you meet the need, and you come home. And so that's okay. At the same time, there are definitely people who spend their whole career on the field. One of my heroes is Heidi Baker in Mozambique, and she's been there basically her whole life. She got her doctorate and then she went overseas, and that's it. And visits a lot back into the States and other countries and stuff like that, but still that's her job. That's where she needs to be. These people are my heroes. Amy Carmichael, in India forever, never came home the entire time she was in India. I mean, we came home every summer.
Sure, yeah.
Every summer. And so my son is able to, be with friends, and he's hanging out at the beach and doing all these things, and I tell people that, and they're like, well, you're not really a missionary. And I'm like, there's all kinds of missionaries.
It's true. And almost that lowers the barriers to entry and maybe the risk and the perceivable threats that people may think about considering traditional missions. Oh, if I go, I've got to be there for decades. But I think because the world has shrunk so much, it makes it more accessible to a lot of people. And well done, as you said, that people have different roles within mission work now, and different vocations are invested. So while you were there, it looks glorious, full-time ministry. I'm sure mountaintop experience after mountaintop experience, or was it not?
It's just a mixed bag. Before I left for Ukraine, I was teaching math history, and there is a Persian historian who visited India and tried to talk about Indian culture and that sort of thing. And his description was that it was a mix of pearls and shells. And you never quite knew what you were going to get. It could be the most costly thing and the most amazing thing, and it could be also the most worthless thing. And that's basically what we found. If you go through 70 years of communism, there's got to be lingering effects, even if there's independence. And so that's what we found. We found that not only in, the civilian world and government, et cetera, but in churches. And we found that communism was, in some cases, alive and well. And so you would run into these people, and some of these, pastors are still friends, and others who were just loyal, true, would do anything, would do whatever they said they were going to do, all these kinds of things. And then you just find the lies, the deception, just the complete disregard for other human beings. And again, that's just, I think, an influence of being in an atheistic society, no moral foundation whatsoever. And so it was just this mix, and it was just constant. There was just the greatest hopes and the most desperate kinds of fears. We were over there during the Orange Revolution, and that is like the case in point. You have all of these hopes of the new generation. Things are really going to be different now. We're going to get new people into leadership, and they're not going to be corrupt, and they're going to, have the people in mind, for whatever it is that they're doing. And so people, they sweep these new people into government, hopes are high, and then the new people turn out to be exactly like the old people. And it's not only the Orange Revolution, then the Maidan Revolution happened in 2014. Exactly same thing happened afterward. These people just turned out to be so corrupt who took over. And so then you wonder, will things ever change? And again, not just government, but church, and I mean, just everything, where you really kind of expect it to be different. So, yeah, I mean, it was very incredibly disappointing sometimes, but at the same time, the experiences that we had over there, I mean, were just indescribably different and good and positive, and so it's just kind of this and that.
I think the idealism, the romanticism of the mission life, almost as it's described, paints it to be this glorious rose-colored existence where masses are flocking to you and giving their life to Christ and everything's going perfectly. But the adverse often is the case, and it's almost like a long obedience in the same direction. It's a constant. But how did that discovery and cycle of sorts weigh on you and your family? Did it have an effect on ministry or with those that you worked with? Did you find yourself constantly in need of encouraging them?
I mean, there were definitely times of disillusionment with people that I was working with, knowing that they simply could not be trusted. And when you're talking about a pastor, I mean, that's kind of a revelation. You don't really think in those terms in this country, that somebody would be out for their own good and, what they call sheep abuse, among pastors, and they're just going to use the people up, for whatever it is that they need to get done and however it is that they want to live. The pastor's living so much better than the people in the church was really, I never got used to that. And the people in the church are happy, just, the pastor's got a beautiful car and he's got a beautiful house and he's got, and they're like completely fine with that. And I'm just like, whatever, Anyway, so, so I never really got over it. I sort of made peace with it. Like, this is just the way it's going to be. And so stop being disappointed all the time because it's just people.
Yeah. So 1 year turns to 2 turns to 3. Every year, save the 2-year recommitment, you recommitted for another year. How does it come to the point where you recognize this season is coming to an end? There's something else that's waiting for me. The Lord has another plan. How is it that you turn loose of one thing and move to the next?
I was always of the opinion that one of my goals being there was to do myself out of a job. So I wanted to disciple to the point that somebody could take over for me, and especially a Ukrainian, because I just thought it was a very artificial situation. Interestingly, the Ukrainians were always okay with, somebody, a foreigner, being in charge. That they were just used to, from Russia, from other countries coming in and taking them over, somebody else is in charge. It's not us. And I really worked for years to try to get them to think differently about that. But anyway, it's a combination of circumstances, just like everything else. 2 years before we left, our son graduated high school. He went to college in the States. So now we're in 2 different countries, and we did that for 2 years, and that just gets old. When your child is spending holidays with other relatives and not you, no, that's unacceptable, especially to the mother. And so that was certainly one thing. And then another thing was just simply, I felt like this person who I'd been working with for the entire time is just ready to take over. And so I really didn't give that person any choice. I said, we're leaving and you're in charge. And it was a shock, of course, but even she would say, yeah, I'm ready.
It was time.
So, and that's fine. And, so in other words, it wasn't a pining away for being back in America and, having everything in America and stuff like that. It was definitely a pining away for our son. But, it was just like, okay, what's next? That's fine. And God provided a job right here. And so it was not a difficult transition.
Would you say there was a clearness committee moment or personages in that transition back to the States?
No, that was just super gradual. And I had thought about it for a couple of years, is this the time? Is this the time? Is this the time? And then it's just finally, okay, enough has happened. I think it's time. I'm sure other people, the stories would be different, and there would be a clearness committee, and like, oh, right, especially if you haven't been thinking about it, and God has to kind of try to convince you, like He did to come, to leave.
Sure.
And I think that there are a lot of missionaries who aren't listening to God,
and overstay,
way overstay,
sure.
And they almost look at it, some of them, as a retirement program. Living in a country with an economy where I don't have to spend a lot of money, and people are always friendly, and I always have something to do, and it just becomes this kind of dependence situation, which is just bad. So yeah, I was very glad that we did not get to that point.
That's so good. And you hit on a huge topic within mission work, that it is to work yourself out of a job, and to be able to hand that off to local individuals to run what is with. And so I recognize the struggle of trying to convince someone this is not what you really want, someone from outside to be handling this, which actually belongs to you. So just real quick, you came back to the States. What was the timeline between your arrival back and your time beginning here at Southern Wesleyan?
Almost immediate, because I was starting a 12-month position. So I started like right at the beginning of July, and we got back in beginning of June. So yeah, it was real quick, probably too quick, but anyway,
not quite enough time to settle back in.
Yeah,
that brings up another thing, the sort of reverse culture shock of coming back to your home country is significant, and something that I think people often discount. They assume that everybody who comes back so excited and thrilled that they can find restaurants that are open 24 hours a day and ridiculous channels on TV. How was that process of coming back to this American culture?
Well, it was a lot easier for us because we had been back every summer. So not only were we used to the States, but also we still had relationships with people. So it's not like we're starting over, that kind of thing, although we were in a different location. So in that sense, we were starting over. But, we knew missionaries on the field. Their child had never been to the States. There was a classmate of my son's who had not been to the States for 14 years.
Incredible.
Okay. So he comes up to senior year in high school, and the parents simply decided, you need to spend senior year in the United States, because you don't know what's going on, and you're going to wind up in college and you're not going to have any idea. And so fortunately, that was not a concern of ours. I do think that sometimes missionaries fall in love with their country so much that it becomes they become very negative towards the United States or wherever they're from. And that's kind of too bad too. We saw, it was very clear to us, the shortcomings of the United States. And the more that we talked to, people in other countries, the more you could see from their perspective, kind of what they were seeing with the government and et cetera, et cetera. And, it does give you some perspective. But, I was asked at one point, would I like to become a Ukrainian citizen? And to become a Ukrainian citizen, you have to give up your current citizenship. And I said, you must be joking, that's like the most precious thing that I have, about me. It's my US passport. And I can go so many places and do so many things with complete freedom. I would never give that up. So even as I'm very willing to move overseas, including, by the way, buying an apartment, not just renting, and really investing, I was not willing to give up those roots, as some are. And, I guess in some cases for good reason, but in other cases because they didn't have such great experiences here. And so they're just going to kind of, diss the States and, like, this is so much better and everything else like that. Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah. And now that you have been back for these many years, I know you keep in contact with the people you work with. Is there a chance that a Paul Shotsberger would one day return to Ukraine for a season?
Yeah. I suppose there's always a chance. My wife has declared a moratorium on international travel. So I suspect that she's not going to be moving overseas. Sure. That said, I have, just very recently come into kind of other opportunities in different countries other than Ukraine. So my world has been broadened just slightly. And so I don't necessarily feel the pull, like I once did, to necessarily go back to Ukraine. Could I go someplace sometime in the future? Yeah. Might it be Ukraine? Not sure, Could it be someplace else though? Yeah, definitely. So it's kind of like, where's the need? It's exactly the initial question, where's the need? And I would be willing to go. My wife might require a little bit of convincing, but that's okay.
So it's supernatural.
Oh yeah. It was supernatural the first time. It would be supernatural this time.
So for just in closing, for those who may be listening and feel the slightest tug, maybe they feel that they would like to entertain just an investment or a step toward a call to missions, even short term, even just maybe in considering a short-term trip, what would be your counsel to someone who maybe just feels a little bit of a stirring inwardly?
There are a lot of people that I know, because I teach college students, who have a notion that they want to go overseas, but they literally have no experience overseas. And I think that's the worst combination possible, because they will agree to something that they don't understand. And so I am fully in favor of doing actually what my wife and I did, which is spend a couple of weeks, and just check things out. Don't just go over blind because you say, God's calling. It's not like the old days where you had to take the rickety sailing ship, across the ocean and stuff like that. I mean, you get there in, a few hours, and you can spend a few days, even weeks, and then you don't know everything for sure, but you know much better. And so one of the things that I believe in very strongly is short-term missions. I know that there are a lot of people out there who poo-poo it now and say, what a waste of money, just to have the Americans come and be these, white knights and provide all these things and then leave. And that's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is it provides you with an experience that you simply can't get otherwise. And so I've been leading missions trips every year. What doesn't matter. Ukraine, we've got one coming up to Kenya. So I think that's terribly valuable. When I was between sophomore and junior years in college, I went to Austria for 2 months. And that's what put not only the love of missions in my heart, but also the love for Europe in my heart. And I knew I was going to come back sometime, but I had no idea it was going to be in the middle of my life. And so those seeds had already been planted. That work had already been done. So when I hear about going to Europe, it's just like, well, sure, of course, because I have a burden for Europe. I think that's where these burdens come from, is the short-term missions. So I encourage anybody, just get some experience. It may seem like, I don't know what, a lot of money for a short amount of time, but you cannot replicate that experience. And so that would be my encouragement.
That's great counsel. I think for those who feel the urging and feel the call, it's such a great time in history that we live, where things are so much more accessible, and it seems that God moves people in seasons and provides these great kingdom connections. Anyhow, that was fantastic. Thank you for that, and we hope you all will tune in next time for our next podcast. Thanks for sharing with us today.
Thank you.